So I'm going to kick off some discussion here, and please just raise your hands, and I'll go to you. We'll jump around to audience questions for sure. It seems to me as I'm sitting here listening to the presentations that what's going on in the sort of opening up a spotlight or a floodlight on the biology of blood through these new tools is really analogous to the story of diagnostics in general, which are the development of new diagnostics tools that start stratifying broad patient populations into smaller and smaller groups identifiable by characteristics that we previously couldn't really look for, or certainly couldn't look for them in any kind of efficient way. And that's what we obviously just heard about blood typing, is that there are many who are identified by very specific blood factors that we just didn't see earlier or didn't know that we needed to look for. And you just heard some about the clinical imperatives of why we need to be able to identify these smaller and smaller populations, because those patients are going to have to be treated differently, even if it's just as simple as giving them a certain blood unit for transfusion. So our speakers also called out both some of the kind of cost and economic challenges, called out a little bit some of the challenges of FDA approval, and everyone, I think, touched on reimbursement. And reimbursement is often the biggest challenge in diagnostics. I think, those of you who listen to AdvaMedDx come up on the Hill over the past, number of years, we obviously talk a lot about FDA and those challenges. Those certainly exist. But at the end of the day, ultimately, it's really about what's the market when you get through FDA. Do you really get a reasonable return on investment? And a lot of companies make a decision way up in the R&D process that no matter how good their technology is, they know they can develop, it just may not be worth trying to bring it to the market here. And so I guess one of my first questions, and maybe I'll actually ask you, Dr. Katz, because you talked about the availability of assays currently on the market now, and assays have been on the market for a long time, and you referenced briefly that in other countries, and I think maybe you said Europe, there's a lot of tools on the market in this space, and maybe you could opine briefly on why you think that's the case.
It's really complicated. It's a two-edged sword, and I think you know how I feel about this. That the process at FDA is incredibly rigorous, most particularly in the blood screening space. And that has to do with a lot of history of hepatitis and HIV and other things, not wanting to get burned at the end of the day. But the FDA's process is incredibly rigorous, and the assays that we get perform in the blood donor screening space, which is a little different than the diagnostic space. Their performance characteristics are unbelievably good, almost without exception. But the cost of getting assays with those kinds of performance characteristics, our process is so rigorous we believe it is beginning to discourage entry into the U.S. market, most particularly with infectious diseases donor screening assays for things that we're anticipating might become problems as time rolls by. It's a real two-edged sword. When I ran my lab at the blood center, I loved the performance of the assays because I didn't get noise from them. I didn't have what we call false positives, people who got positive tests who didn't have what we were looking for, and then I would have to explain that to the donor. And that's wonderful. But the lack of diversity in the market is very, very worrisome. We may find ourselves in a position with an emerging pathogen or these kinds of technologies where companies don't want to make the investment because the ROI, in part driven by what it takes to get through the FDA, isn't worth it. And we're very, very worried. I come from an ID background, infectious diseases background, where we think the problem is now, and I'm very concerned about our ability to generalize these technologies in our donor testing labs because of cost issues.
Maybe I could ask Dr. Banerjee, could you just talk a little bit more about your company's considerations as you were looking ahead to going through the FDA process that you just successfully navigated, obviously without talking about proprietary information, but what was the overall calculus you were all making as you thought about the fact that you were going to have to go through FDA, and you pointed out you'd have to go through the most stringent of FDA review. What were your considerations as you thought about the market that you were hoping to get into versus the costs of all the work from an R&D and clinical standpoint?
I think as far as these molecular immunohematology testing is concerned, sort of FDA's viewpoint has always been the same, that because this is playing into the space which has traditionally been very heavily controlled, the process or the product that has been or will be developed will have to go through the PMA process. So we just had to make the decision, and I don't want to, really play it down, that what Dr. Cass says is absolutely true, that it really takes a lot in order to go through the process. It's a very, very rigorous process where the FDA not only really checks the efficacy of the product, but they actually come to the site and check the manufacturing capability of the company and all kinds of records. So you really have to be prepared to go through these rigors in order to bring the final product up to the bar of PMA approval. So it's really, as I look at it, it's really a judgment call on the part really of the company, that if you want to play in this space and you want to have a approved assay, this is probably the hoop that you're required to jump through, and that sort of was our take on it.
I definitely want to come to talk a little more about reimbursement and some of these economic issues, but Dr. Moulds, is there anything else that you might want to weigh in terms of a perspective on FDA?
Speaking from Grifols, I'm glad that Imicor went first.
Does that help?
It helps. It helps because the folks at FDA have now been educated about this, and I think it makes it easier for us being a second company to do that. But you're absolutely right. There is a lot, clinical trials are required, extensive record keeping, inspections, and everything has to be pre-planned before you even do the application. So although it seemed like it was a very short period for approval, it's years of work that go into that before you even get to the application process.
Well, I think we don't need to dwell a whole lot more on the comparison to other countries. I would just point out generally that AdvaMed has certainly been involved in this debate for a while, and we would never argue that there shouldn't be an effective gatekeeper for patient safety in the U.S., but it's certainly been noted that, as Dr. Katz said, across the entire medical device field, including diagnostics, there are many more products coming to market years earlier in other key areas like Europe and Asia, long before those technologies are available to patients here in the U.S. and without any real notable difference in adverse events or patient safety. So there's clearly something here to continue looking at from a U.S. policy standpoint. But let's turn a little more back to the kind of the economics and the reimbursement challenges here. And I think, as Dr. Banerjee alluded to, the process for a company going to market is to both obtain a code, which is then used in the billing process that payers can see what that test is and assign a payment rate to that code, but also getting a decision from payers to actually cover the product, and then obtaining an actual payment rate. So there's three kind of key pieces to this puzzle. It can, in fact, be somewhat arduous and take some time. Dr. Banerjee talked very briefly about having navigated that system, I think, in about a year to get a code and finalized. It can take up to a couple of years. One of the provisions in the legislation I referenced earlier actually provides for the immediate assignment of temporary codes, which we hope will significantly help out in this process. But let's drill down right onto just coding for one moment quickly. Dr. Banerjee, you mentioned that you got a Tier 2 code, which, if I understand correctly, is a kind of a general bucket code. It doesn't identify your test specifically. It identifies a general type of test that you fall under. Would you see advantages at some point to the coding process making available a Tier 1 code that would have more specificity for you?
I think this is still kind of open issue. That whether they want to go with another specific code or they want to suffix it out. I mean, this is still, as far as I know, in my limited understanding of it, this is still being sort of debated. But that's the about at present the resolution I have on that issue.
Dr. Katz, sure.
I want to point out that when those CPT codes are assigned, that's well and good. It doesn't touch the issue of how we screen large numbers of donors and donor centers, because we're not doing diagnostics or patient care. So there's another side to the reimbursement issue that, I mean, my dream is that I have at my blood center a computer full of these extended types. And so when Art calls me and says, I need XYZ ABC, I go on my keyboard, pull a unit out of inventory or bring the donor in if we don't have it in inventory and send it to him. And the CPT codes, the reimbursement for diagnostics, doesn't touch the donor side.
So I think we probably don't need to say a lot more about coding at the moment, but for those of you who are saying, what the heck are you people talking about here with codes, I would just say that one of the big issues in the coding system for diagnostics is the need for increased transparency, more specific codes that allow developers of tests to identify their tests specifically as opposed to this more general coding system. And progress is probably being made as a result of some of the legislation that was just passed. But let's get back to, I think, the more critical issues of kind of rubber meets the road in terms of, is there a market out there that really supports the value of diagnostic tests? And I think what we're seeing here, what was just illustrated so nicely from a clinical standpoint, is that we now have tools that can open up a clear explanation of a patient's unique set of blood markers, and yet our reimbursement, I think, is really stuck in the past when it comes to thinking about value. There's tremendous value that was just described from being able to produce this inventory that Dr. Katz talked about that is now sorted by all these markers, and yet reimbursement, nobody's thinking differently about, okay, where's the value here? Who pays more? Because there's in fact more value being recognized in the system. And one of the challenges, of course, is that the value is being recognized in some cases for very small portions of the overall population. And yet for those patients in those scenarios, the value of being able to have that highly matched unit is tremendous. So I wonder if I could ask any of our speakers perhaps to opine on, how do we get past these challenges? We're sort of stuck in the past of looking at what's the cost to bring a test to a patient or to run a screen on a unit of blood, but we're not really thinking about how do you incentivize and reward these tremendous advances in technology. Should I call on someone, or does anyone want to weigh in on how we kind of solve this real challenge? Sure.
I think when you look at this space, right? I mean, the difference with other diagnostic tests is really there are two parties here. There are two ends, which you have to meet. There is a donor side, and then there is the patient side. Whereas like Dr. Katz was very correctly pointing out that the patient side reimbursement schemes, etc., seem to be congealing, taking effect, and maybe we are making some headway. Really, there is nothing for recovering the value for the donor testing. So, really, this is the complication here. How to really play these two worlds together in a synergistic fashion and basically make it work in the most efficient fashion. And one of the ways, again, Dr. Katz pointed out, is having really the therapeutic axis, connecting these two pools together efficiently so that we can really reap the benefits of the money that is being put in testing and characterizing both the donor and the patient population. So I think that's imperative.
There's a way to do an assessment of this issue based on what we know about the frequency of the things we're looking for in the recipient population, and the frequencies in the donor populations, and how often sicklers or thals or myelodysplastic get alloimmunized, and what it costs to take care of them if that happens. And we can do cost utility assessment. It'd be hard, but it can be done, that says this is how far we want to go with this. Tell me how much safety you want in the blood supply. Tell me how much you're willing to pay for it. And we can work within those parameters. Somebody has to tell us in the overall scheme of healthcare, it seems to me, does this make your priority list? Or how far down on the priority list or up on the priority list it goes? I think it can be done, but number one, we won't do it if companies don't develop the assays. That's another issue. But I think it can be done. It just requires the will to prioritize.
Well, one of the things that we really need to do is we need to engage those who are on the receiving end. Unfortunately, the way that we conduct a lot of our business we really don't have informed choice or informed consent on the part of the patients. So there's a movement now that's afoot, it's relatively new. It's called patient blood management, and it focuses on making sure that there's a need for the component, making sure that the person that's receiving the component is fully aware of the benefit-risk assessment in terms of the transfusion. And so we've got a long way to go. Now, there are entities within government, the Advisory Committee on Blood Safety and Availability, where you can have this hearing and have the public begin to speak its voice. But I think it's really important to engage the public in terms of deciding how far we go.
Well, I think, just speaking generally, I think we all face that challenge, is that there's so much going on in the diagnostics field generally, that the general public, and even for that matter, clinicians in some cases don't have fully aware of the tools that are now available. And I think we're all interested in raising that awareness level. So Dr. Bracey, if I understand it correctly, you're a customer for, these units of blood, and I think have an appreciation for obviously what goes into, the tools that give you the higher matched units that you may be looking for. And yet, as a customer, you're constrained, of course, by who's paying at the end of the day for the services you provide and the units of blood that you purchase and transfuse. So how do you see, you're sort of stuck in that middle, and you see private payers or Medicare, for example, reimbursing for these units. What case would you make to a private payer, for example, to say you really should increase your reimbursement rate for this, because then if you do that, I can pull in tremendous value from the diagnostic side?
Right. Again, I think it gets back to what Dr. Katz was speaking to earlier, and that is we need to do some additional cost-effectiveness studies in terms of assessing the adverse outcomes associated with not having the blood more closely matched. The tools exist. These studies can be done, and at the end of the day, we do have to answer some really hard questions to the people in there. Everyone in the hospital now has a supply chain. We used to answer to the vice president, but now we answer to the supply chain. And when we answer to the supply chain, we have to explain exactly why we have to have a cost increment related to a given product. But I think that there's opportunity for, doing some cost analysis studies that will shore up the demand.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, please, go ahead.
On the screening side, you said the genotyping is only done once for the patient. Could you touch a little bit more on the infectious disease side, like how many diseases you test for? Is that an FDA requirement and other?
Actually, that's probably more of a Dr. Katz question, but Louis, do you want to do that?
Yeah, I didn't show that. The last time I counted it up, it was 8 or 9. And not only 8 or 9, but we do 3 tests for hepatitis B, 2 for hepatitis C, 2 for HIV. We screen for Chagas disease, an interesting discussion, syphilis, a virus called HTLV that nobody's ever heard of, CMV, and we do our infectious disease testing on every donation, of course, because while your genes don't change between last Saturday and this Saturday, the sexually transmitted diseases or bloodborne pathogens you carry could change. And so that's done, and I can tell you that at my former center 2 years ago was last time, it was about $52 we thought was our real cost for a unit of blood. On average, you saw median was around $220. $52 or $54 of that in my center was infectious disease testing. The assay that Immucor has gotten approval for, we figured out our cost to do it with RUO was $50, but it was one time. And so that sickler who has access to that donor forever, it has to be cost effective. If we do that health technology assessment, it's inconceivable that having that inventory, it's not an inventory, it's a database of donors and donations. It's inconceivable at the rates that they make antibodies that it's not cost effective.
And it is required by FDA?
The infectious disease tests that we do are all required by FDA. Yeah. And we have to do ABO and RH. That's what FDA requires for blood typing.
And are they likely to change over the next few years on the number of infectious disease tests?
It only goes up.
Oh, it's going to get worse, yeah.
There hasn't been a transmission of syphilis in the United States by blood since 1966, and we're still doing it. So, Is that because we're testing? Or is it because syphilis became rare? That's just prioritizing and making decisions about how safe is safe enough. And that's one question. The other question is who decides? And it can't be me because I need help.
Any other questions from the floor? Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists and invite them to make any last comments. If there's anything else you want our audience to be sure to walk out of the room thinking about. Any of you have any final comments along those lines? Dr.
One
Bracey?
comment, in order to make these assays most efficient, we need to think of ways to share the data. We know that, for example, with patients that have sickle cell disease, even with the current technology, that we don't adequately share data, and what we know that this puts patients at risk. So we need to carefully think within our industry, how can we most effectively share data that will improve the quality of our patients' lives, and this would be particularly important as we add in the layer of molecular diagnostics to avoid redundant, unneeded testing.
Any other wrap-up comments?
I guess the only thing I would say is I don't expect you guys to understand ABO or RH or CAL or anything else. But what we want from you guys is some business cards of the people that are going to be interested so that we can now come and sit in your office and go through this stuff in enough detail that you understand where we're coming from. There's a patient at the end of every one of these units of blood, and we want them to get what they need.
Great. Well, I think that's probably as good a comment as any to wrap up on. I'd call to your attention 3 websites just very briefly: AdvaMedDx.org, dx.org, which I referenced before, of course, and we have a wealth of information on diagnostics. AdvaMed.org, to which there's a link on our site, of course, is our parent association, and also a wealth of information on the whole medical device sector, information on science, technology, and policy. And finally, lifechanginginnovation.org, which is a web-based campaign that we power, featuring a lot of stories from people on the ground who work in our member companies and the kind of value that they're bringing to the field, and lots of other information, including medical device sector jobs by state, and so forth. So information that I think many of you will find interesting. I commend all of those websites to your attention as a resource. And finally, I would say please join me in thanking again our panel. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.